It should be noted that the idea of falsifiability, as the defining characteristic of science, originated with philosopher Karl Popper in the 1930s. More recent elaborations on his thinking have expanded the narrowest interpretation of his principle, precisely because it would eliminate too many branches of clearly scientific endeavor.
But which branches of scientific endeavor is he referring to? He doesn't say. Evolutionary perhaps? Intelligent design advocates claim that spontaneous generation and macroevolution, or any imagined form of upward evolution process of increasing complexity, is impossible, and point out that all experiments that were ever done have thus far repeatedly failed to show any convincing evidence of such an upward phenomenon being possible, but that thermodynamic principles have negated it, by causing experiments to show the opposite. Does that qualify? Whether you view it as falsifiable or not, it is hard to see how the abiogenesis idea, or the macroevolution concept, could be anything but an argument from ignorance, and perhaps a sort of religious idea. Does this naturalism of the gaps, at least cast doubt on the scientific plausibility of such an endeavor? Or does a preconditioned, naturalistic philosophy by exclusion, blind one to such rational questioning? Excluding the intelligent creation model as another possibility for investigation, does not seem reasonable in these circumstances.
4. Increasingly, scientists doubt the truth of evolution.
No evidence suggests that evolution is losing adherents. Pick up any issue of a peer-reviewed biological journal, and you will find articles that support and extend evolutionary studies, or that embrace evolution as a fundamental concept. Conversely, serious scientific publications disputing evolution are all but non-existent.
Evolution is most certainly a fundamental concept, and much of it is indeed scientific. However, certain types of unproven hypothetical forms of evolution are losing adherents. When scientists dispute evolution, they generally don't dispute the proven types of evolution, such as microevolution or the law of increasing entropy, etc., but the unproven hypothetical types which include abiogenesis and macroevolution, and those concepts are losing adherents. Once again Rennie throws his biased ideologically driven, conflated, bait-and-switch, straw-man argumentation on the unsuspecting reader. Are adherents to those hypothetical forms of evolution equivalent to blindly committed fanatical believers of a religious faith? It might seem so. An increasing number of scientists are beginning to suspect this too. In 2019, over 1,000 scientists from all over the world had by then signed up to the statement, "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life." Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Dissent from Darwin.org retrieved 14th of June 2020. This includes 15 scientists from the National Academies of Science in countries including Russia, the Czech Republic, Brazil, and the United States, as well as from the Royal Society. Many of the signers are professors or researchers at major universities and international research institutions such as the University of Cambridge, the British Museum of Natural History, Moscow State University, Hong Kong University, the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, Institut de Paléontologie Humaine in France, Ben Gurion University in Israel, MIT, the Smithsonian, Yale and Princeton. Appealing to consensus can be a double-edged sword. How popular or disliked the idea is, has no real bearing on its actual truth. We are interested in evidence, not belief systems. That is why the idea of evolution creating more functional complexity does lose adherents. There are people, including many qualified scientists, who have written publications disputing this idea within Darwinian evolution theory, because like any good scientist, they require evidence, not unsubstantiated belief. For example, from two qualified scientists who have put forth some articles, Michael Behe, and his book Darwin's Black Box, Stephen Meyer, and his book, Signature in the Cell, and Darwin's doubt. Both are well-known intelligent design advocates. Some support evolution theory but present many problems that they are having with it. There have been atheists who have changed their minds, that is to say, they are no longer atheists, because of the evidence against evolution as an upward creative process to build more complex functionality, and conversely, reasons to think it more plausible for intelligent design. Honest free speech is important. Honest and open questions are important. The only good scientist is humble, because they will not let any ideology interfere with their objectivity. Who decides which publications are scientifically serious enough to be viewed as acceptable? And what gives them that right over others? July 1, 2002, Rennie's article said,
In the mid-1990s, George W. Gilchrist, of the University of Washington, surveyed thousands of journals in the primary literature, seeking articles on intelligent design or creation science. Among those hundreds of thousands of scientific reports, he found none. In the past 2 years, surveys done independently by Barbara Forrest of Southeastern Louisiana University and Lawrence M. Krauss of Case Western Reserve University, have been similarly fruitless. Creationists retort that a closed-minded, scientific community rejects their evidence. Yet according to the editors of Nature, Science, and other leading journals, few anti-evolution manuscripts are even submitted. Some anti-evolution authors have published papers in serious journals. Those papers, however, rarely attack evolution directly or advance creationist arguments. At best, they identify certain evolutionary problems as unsolved and difficult, which no one disputes. In short, creationists are not giving the scientific world good reason to take them seriously.
One might ask, can the journalist say truthfully that no scientists take this issue seriously? Clearly not. How would he know? Has he spoken to every scientist out there? So what does he mean? The phrase close-minded scientific community seems like an oxymoron, since science, by its very definition, is the discipline of open inquiry, and therefore of open-mindedness. Either you're close-minded or you're scientific, but you cannot, in principle, be both, at least not until you have irrefutable substantiation, one way or the other. So how can science in such a case make claims of 100% certainty? It can be rather difficult in this area. Where is the logical truth amid this information? First, the article claims that such publications are all but non-existent, and then a few sentences later, it says that few are rarely published. So, which is it? Rarely or non-existent? Rarely would imply that some do exist, right? So, there are a few. It all seems partially disingenuous. Despite his biased opinions, the facts do emerge sometimes. At least Rennie admits that there are certain evolutionary problems that haven't been solved which no one disputes. But whether creationists are giving the scientific world a reason to take them seriously is not up to the cursory opinion of the journalist, since he can't read everyone's minds, but how individual scientists produce repeatable empirical evidence. He has put a negative spin on it. The troubling thing here is the apparent inappropriate concern as to whether the criticism is coming from a creationist, evolutionist, or anyone else. Assuming that you are not predisposed to scientifically irrelevant, ad hominem bias, if the criticisms are valid, then what does it matter? History has shown that consensus can, and has, been wrong at times. Dogmatic assertions about ideologies should be irrelevant, and yet it seems to be a prominent feature in this article. Is this an argument derived from objective scientific evidence, or an argument simply appealing to a materialistic worldview bias? It can equally be said, some atheistic evolutionary authors have published papers in serious journals. Those papers, however, rarely attack the idea of intelligent creation directly, or prove evolutionist arguments. At best, They identify certain creation teachings as unobservable, or incomplete, in their explanations, or sometimes might engage in character assassination of some creationists. In this regard, certain evolutionists are not giving scientists good enough reason to take them seriously. When framed in such a way, arguments from either side are somewhat meaningless.
5. The disagreements among even evolutionary biologists show how little solid science supports evolution.
Evolutionary biologists passionately debate diverse topics: how speciation happens, the rates of evolutionary change, the ancestral relationships of birds and dinosaurs, whether Neanderthals were a species apart from modern humans, and much more. These disputes are like those found in all other branches of science. Acceptance of evolution as a factual occurrence and a guiding principle is nonetheless universal in biology.
Yes, but common acceptance or consensus doesn't prove anything much. Passionate debates are not much good without evidence, or solid science, and no good either with just ideological dogma. One might say, if you want to believe that there are ancestral relationships between dinosaurs and birds, go ahead, but don't call it science. Acceptance of intelligent design is a factual occurrence and is also a guiding principle for many biologists, even if they don't all officially proclaim it. Microevolution is probably universally accepted, but not all accept macroevolution or abiogenesis. The writer is claiming that the acceptance of evolution is universal in biology. That is not quite true. We are being baited and switched. Most people are aware that many accept evolution, and yet there is much debate about how it does, or doesn't happen. That is a good enough reason to give it the unbiased scrutiny that it deserves. Let's continue.
Unfortunately, dishonest creationists have shown a willingness to take scientists' comments out of context to exaggerate and distort the disagreements. Anyone acquainted with the works of paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University knows that in addition to co-authoring the punctuated equilibrium model, Gould was one of the most eloquent defenders and articulators of evolution. Punctuated equilibrium explains patterns in the fossil record by suggesting that most evolutionary changes occur within geologically brief intervals, which may, nonetheless, amount to hundreds of generations. Yet creationists delight in dissecting out phrases from Gould's voluminous prose, to make him sound as though he had doubted evolution, and they present punctuated equilibrium as though it allows new species to materialize overnight, or birds to be born from reptile eggs. When confronted with a quotation from a scientific authority that seems to question evolution, insist on seeing the statement in context. Almost invariably, the attack on evolution will prove illusory.
Let's not waste time considering the dishonest arguments from dishonest creationists and dishonest evolutionists. Let's just concern ourselves with the honest ones, shall we? And never mind the straw man hyperbole involving birds being born from reptile eggs. Rennie has not informed his readers much at all. It's manifestly difficult to know how much Gould doubted evolution, and we can discuss why. Let's talk about the real problems. Whether upward evolutionary changes occur at all and within geologically brief intervals that amount to hundreds of generations, has not been demonstrated. These are interesting beliefs but not facts. The only thing here of any importance is where the actual evidence takes us. Gould was open in saying that the fossil record shows no gradual progression toward more complexity, but instead there is some kind of punctuated equilibrium being demonstrated. Even though he admits to having no definitive evidence of what the cause is, but remaining enamored with the macroevolution hypothesis, at least he has been honest and forthright in admitting it. Here are some quotes from Stephen Jay Gould. Make of them what you will. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. Stephen Jay Gould, Evolution Now, Macmillan Publishing, 1982, 140. I regard the failure to find a clear vector of progress in life's history as the most puzzling fact of the fossil record. But I also believe that we are now on the verge of a solution. Stephen Jay Gould, The Ediacaran Experiment, February 1984. If Gould was still alive today, he perhaps might have been very disappointed in what he had put faith in. Even without context, these quotes are unambiguous. Moreover, punctuated equilibrium is just an observation of how the fossils were arranged in the strata, and they don't explain much else about the discrete punctuated forms. The term itself just acknowledges that organisms seem to suddenly appear, without the hypothetically predicted gradual intermediate steps being there in the fossils, and to have inscrutable long periods of stasis in the record, and then how they sometimes suddenly disappear later in the record. And this is, in Darwinist terms, an enigma. Various guesses are invoked to try and explain this enigma, where such fossils are largely found in what is commonly called the Cambrian explosion. Complexity seems to appear in the fossil record, seemingly as if from nowhere, that is, without gradual preceding transitional evolutionary fossilized stages. As for the cause of such phenomena, we can only use our imaginations. A true test of a good hypothesis is if it makes good predictions. Darwin posited the number of intermediate varieties, which have formerly existed on the Earth, must be truly enormous. Darwin, The Origin of Species, 1859. This attempted prediction from his hypothesis was a spectacular failure. An enormous variety of intermediate forms have not been found at all. But where are these imagined missing links? Darwin himself honestly asked, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Evolutionists have cherry-picked from the fossil record, and speculated on whether perhaps some examples might represent intermediates, like Acanthostiga, an amphibian, Archaeopteryx, a bird, and Ambulostus, a land mammal. Gould honestly admitted the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches, the rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Gould, S. J. Evolution's Erratic Pace, Natural History, Volume 86, No. 5, 1216, May 1977. Darwin's ad hoc hypothesis, to rescue this gradualist part of his theory from falsification, was to suggest that the geological record is extremely imperfect, and so it is claimed that the postulated intermediate links were not fossilized, but destroyed, and this was an attempt to explain why no one has been able to prove that those posited amounts of intermediates ever existed at all. But this is a paradox within the Darwinian worldview. In 1977 Gould wrote that Darwin's argument of the fossil record being imperfect still persists as the favored escape of most paleontologists from the embarrassment of a record that seems to show so little of evolution directly. Stephen Jay Gould, as quoted in Lewin, R. Evolutionary Theory Under Fire, Science Volume 210, 883-887, November 1980. Even Gould's colleague, Niles Eldredge, who was an avid advocate of Darwinian hypotheses when he wrote in 1995, he had to admit, no wonder paleontologists shied away from evolution for so long. It never seemed to happen. Assiduous collecting up cliff faces yields a rate too slow to account for all the prodigious change that has occurred in evolutionary history. When we do see the introduction of evolutionary novelty, it usually shows up with a bang, and often with no firm evidence that the fossils did not evolve elsewhere. Eldredge, N. Reinventing Darwin, 1995. So how was this problem with the evidence handled? Gould and Eldredge proposed their ad hoc hypothesis to explain the observed punctuated equilibrium in the fossils, with the claim that most evolution takes place in small populations, over relatively rapid geological time periods, and it is claimed that therefore, the rapid changes are not preserved in the fossil record. The problem with this idea is that small populations are, in effect, genetic bottlenecks, making rapid changes even more unlikely, and upward transformations seemingly more impossible. Degeneration of a smaller population is far more likely. The theory of punctuated equilibrium agrees with certain patterns found in the fossil record, but is that enough for it to be classified as a theory, instead of just an ad hoc hypothesis? How in principle can it be falsified against the idea of intelligent creation? Evolutionist Stephen Stanley explains, any claim that natural selection operated with great effect exactly where it was least likely to be documented in small, localized, transitory populations would seem to render Darwin's new theory untestable against special creation, and perhaps almost preposterous as a scientific proposition. Stanley, S., Macroevolution, page 93. Are these patterns of rapid change more consistent with evolution or intelligent design? Is there a definitive answer so far on this? Darwin's ad hoc explanation does not hold up, and the explanation given for the punctuated equilibrium doesn't seem to save the materialist idea either. Even if much of the fossil record was destroyed, erasing the missing links or intermediate forms, the remaining evidence left preserved still makes no sense from a Darwinian perspective, because many of those discrete punctuated forms are virtually identical to what is alive today, also with no definitive gradual intermediate forms existing in the world now, making gradualism seem highly improbable as an explanation. If the Darwinian hypothesis were true, you would, according to the laws of probability, expect to see a significant amount of different living intermediate forms now than what remains in the fossil record, but instead, we see mostly the same, not different. What does this powerful empirical evidence suggest? Mark Pagel, who is an evolution advocate, said something quite intriguing. Paleobiologists flock to these scientific visions of a world in a constant state of flux and admixture. But instead of finding the slow, smooth and progressive changes Lyell and Darwin had expected, they saw in the fossil records rapid bursts of change, new species appearing seemingly out of nowhere and then remaining unchanged for millions of years, patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation. Pagel M. Happy Accidents. Nature, Volume 397, page 665, February 25, 1999. Whether you are a creationist, or an evolutionist, you are right to say. Extensive exploration and fossil discovery in following years, after Darwin, have not brought such in-between forms to light. The vast majority of taxonomic orders and families which live today are also found as fossils, yet without fossil transitions. John D. Morris, The Real Nature of the Fossil Record in Creation, Basics and Beyond. Institute for Creation Research, 2013, 228. Here is a quote from a paleontologist. It is hard for us paleontologists, steeped as we are in a tradition of Darwinian analysis, to admit that neo-Darwinian explanations for the Cambrian explosion have failed miserably. New data acquired in recent years, instead of solving Darwin's dilemma, have rather made it worse. Mark Muckman Amen. Praise for Stephen C. Meyer's Darwin's Doubt, Harper 1, 2013, back cover. Even the famous ardent atheist, Richard Dawkins, despite his refusal to acknowledge God's existence, has to honestly admit, according to his definition, that the faunae in the Cambrian explosion are already in an advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear. But even more intriguingly he says, it is as though they were just planted there, without any evolutionary history. Dawkins, The Blind Watchmaker, page 229-230, 1986. One can argue over whether to call punctuated equilibrium a theory or not, but at least we know that it was originally an ad hoc hypothesis, for inadvertently trying to excuse Darwin's wrong predictions about what we would find in the fossil record, and the idea itself is full of gaps, and overall a giant logical leap of faith. Beyond that, who knows? But what about the Cambrian explosion? How are we to explain this biological Big Bang? Many pro-evolutionist / anti-creationist articles try to shift the burden of proof onto the creationists by claiming that the evidence they rely on is negative evidence. In other words, they claim that the absence of evidence is not good enough to dismiss an evolutionary hypothesis, and therefore it might be considered true until proven false, because it falls within the philosophy of naturalism, whereas creationists' claims go outside naturalistic philosophy, and therefore they are considered, by a certain way of definition, more extraordinary. But many scientists think this way of reasoning unsatisfactory. In reality, the burden of proof rests with the one making the claim.
6. If humans descended from monkeys, why are there still monkeys?
This surprisingly common argument reflects several levels of ignorance about evolution. The first mistake is that evolution does not teach that humans descended from monkeys. It states that both have a common ancestor. The deeper error is that this objection is tantamount to asking, if children descended from adults, why are there still adults? New species evolve by splintering off from established ones. When populations of organisms become isolated from the main branch of their family, and acquire sufficient differences to remain forever distinct, the parent species may survive indefinitely thereafter, or it may become extinct.
This is another one of those exclusive arguments that stay within the philosophy of naturalism. This does not even address the evidence, nor the question itself, regarding the traditionally accepted macroevolution hypothesis. Such a constricted philosophy can only ask, what kinds of distinctions, or differences, are unplanned natural processes capable of producing? But might not necessarily ask, what are the limits of nature? In this regard, hypothetical language is not evidence, and it is certainly not wrong, or ignorant, to question the Darwinian ideas of common ancestry. Unfortunately, the mainstream materialist ideology, and also bias against older traditional forms of belief, infects the thought processes of many scientists, which in turn often causes a lack of critical thinking. Some scientists seem to have become somewhat institutionalized and indoctrinated.
7. Evolution cannot explain how life first appeared on Earth.
The origin of life remains very much a mystery, but biochemists have learned about how primitive nucleic acids, amino acids, and other building blocks of life could have formed and organized themselves into self-replicating, self-sustaining units, laying the foundation for cellular biochemistry. Astrochemical analyses hint that quantities of these compounds might have originated in space and fallen to Earth in comets, a scenario that may solve the problem of how those constituents arose under the conditions that prevailed when our planet was young.
Fairly rational statements here when talking about amino acids. The writer used appropriate words and phrases such as might have, and may solve the problem, phrases that are appropriate for stating the hypothetical without being dogmatic. However, to say that biochemists have learned about how other building blocks of life could have formed and organized themselves into self-replicating, self-sustaining units, laying the foundation for cellular biochemistry, is a bit of a stretch in belief and lays a very tottering foundation indeed for cellular biochemistry. If such a process doesn't exist, where does that leave science? Read on.
Creationists sometimes try to invalidate all of evolution by pointing to science's current inability to explain the origin of life. But even if life on Earth turned out to have a non-evolutionary origin, for instance, if aliens introduced the first cells billions of years ago, evolution, since then, would be robustly confirmed by countless microevolutionary and macroevolutionary studies.
But, can we maybe invalidate some parts of the evolution theory, or is the dogma too sacred? The question of how such aliens began would not have been answered, so the question of how first life could originate by natural processes would not have been answered either. How does the microevolution fact, or the macroevolution hypothesis, help in understanding the origin of first life before DNA and molecular machines? Are we allowed to replace aliens with God? As has already been discussed, macroevolution also has not been robustly confirmed at all. And so, we're back to aliens again. Okay. Why be so reliant on aliens, in the explanatory opinions? Because many believe that the hallmarks of design are undeniable. But for a scientist to mention God, is to jeopardize one's future scientific career, perhaps in the secular world. Yet the abiogenesis idea and the macroevolution hypothesis are in some sense religious, even though still philosophically naturalistic. At least he admits that those first cells are a real problem for exclusive naturalism. Aliens are for naturalists, in principle, a naturalism of the gaps explanation, which is their counterpart to the supernaturalists' God of the gaps argument, and therefore not an empirical observation that can be measured in any direct way. In this case, it's religious naturalism. The claim that upward forms of evolution would be robustly confirmed by countless microevolutionary and macroevolutionary studies is faith-based. It might never be proven, or the opposite might be proven. What if it has been disproven and the evidence has been overlooked or ignored? What about the second law? It is presumptuous to infer that macroevolution, the speculated but never observed imaginary large-scale changes over vast time scales, will one day have proof with the same irrefutability that microevolution already has. The observed limited small variations happening now in front of our eyes. Macroevolution, intrinsically the idea of upward evolution, has so far never been observed in the laboratory, but only microevolutionary change has been observed. Because of intellectual laziness or bad training, this empirical demarcation is often ignored, but objective scientific thinkers will not be taken along by such an invalid conflation. Out of professional necessity, scientists are required to be skeptical, even when it comes to naturalistic hypotheses, and therefore, demand empirical observation. Information theory tends to go in contradiction to the idea of upward evolution because the laws of statistical probability are overwhelmingly in favor of downward, entropic processes.
8. Mathematically, it is inconceivable that anything as complex as a protein, let alone a living cell or a human, could spring up by chance.
There has been much conjecture about the unsubstantiated just-so stories within some sections of the scientific community. Here is another unsubstantiated just-so story.
Chance plays a part in evolution, for example, in the random mutations that can give rise to new traits, but evolution does not depend on chance to create organisms, proteins, or other entities. Quite the opposite. Natural selection, the principal known mechanism of evolution, harnesses non-random change, by preserving desirable, adaptive, features, and eliminating undesirable non-adaptive ones. As long as the forces of selection stay constant, natural selection can push evolution in one direction, and produce sophisticated structures, in surprisingly short times.
So naturally occurring upward change, if it existed, would depend on the forces of selection staying constant. On two accounts this looks to be impossible. For upward evolution to be possible, firstly, the forces of selection would have to constantly select information gain, and never select information loss. Secondly, only to the extent that such a gain is even possible in reality, it might then be preserved for future replication without the other actual negative downward mutations of lost information along with it. Both overwhelmingly improbable steps combined seem prohibitively impossible. This idea goes against the observed thermodynamic gradient and all relevant repeatable experiments. Such ideas are propaganda, at best. And they disagree with empirical science. So when encountering a Darwinian speculation, a scientist will ask certain types of questions. Where is the experiment? Have you ever considered a theoretical possibility space for a functional protein to form? How do you demonstrate the production of sophisticated structures, let alone, in surprisingly short times? By that, we mean biological complexity, not crystals and snowflakes forming. It certainly would be surprising. Natural selection is a fact, but what else? The writer's unsubstantiated statements are, as if he had observed and verified upward changes, as if it were a simple thing, and even though chance is observed playing a role in natural selection, none of these things confirm the idea of prebiotic synthesis, or the idea of upward evolution to new and more complex life forms. This remains in the realm of imagination only, and contrary to experiment and all known natural laws. His statement does not objectively distinguish the credulity from the actual science. Natural selection is the principal, known, mechanism of microevolution only, and above and beyond that, it's all speculation. It's an interesting and imaginative belief system, but for this hypothetical argument to have any credibility, evolutionists need to prove, using experimental evidence, that these posited forces of selection before DNA existed, that are imagined to give rise to life from lifeless chemicals, do actually exist, and if they do exist, can accomplish the aforementioned increasing levels of complexity. We would require some definitive demonstration in the laboratory of upward change occurring. It must be irrefutably upward, to substantiate the claim of universal common descent. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. The intelligent design advocates also raise another challenge to the hypothesis, the idea that new and novel genetic information and body plans can be created without intelligent guidance. No one has ever observed such forces of selection pushing evolution in one direction to produce sophisticated structures in surprisingly short times. Information theory, that contradicts such a notion, comes to the fore, a testable theory that has, in this case, remained unfalsified and is also continually verified. Every conceivable type of unguided evolution only seems to head in a downward direction, according to thermodynamic principles, and so far, that is the only direction that has been observed by humans in the laboratory, heading toward more randomness, effectively lower states of potential energy. The only kind of natural selection of life that has been observed is where DNA information already exists. We are waiting. The ball is in the evolutionists' court. And yes, unapologetically, mathematically speaking, it is inconceivable that anything as complex as a protein, let alone a living cell or a human, could spring up by chance, and this realization of the difficulties of a living cell spontaneously generating was proclaimed by the famous Sir Fred Hoyle, who ironically was an atheist, and who also speculated that aliens might have done it. But who, or what, would have created such aliens? In the years since, the science has only strengthened this argument for intelligent causation, inferred, but not specifically identified, by experimental science, as more and more complexity of the cell is continually revealed by science, and this has been investigated many times, both at the theoretical and experimental level. But the speculation continues.
As an analogy, consider the 13-letter sequence, to be or not to be. Those hypothetical million monkeys, each pecking out one phrase a second, could take as long as 78,800 years to find it among the 2,613 sequences of that length. But in the 1980s, Richard Hardison of Glendale College wrote a computer program that generated phrases randomly, while preserving the positions of individual letters that happened to be correctly placed, in effect, selecting for phrases more like Hamlet's. On average, the program recreated the phrase in just 336 iterations, less than 90 seconds. Even more amazing, it could reconstruct Shakespeare's entire play in just 4.5 days.
Reasoning from analogy can be informative. Do you think that this analogy makes a biogenesis, or macroevolution, sound plausible, or implausible. There were some predetermined outcomes built into the program. It was guided in certain ways to an end outcome. We see that there was forethought in preserving the positions of individual letters, and it did not provide a true analogy of a mindless, unplanned process in nature, but rather, if anything, illustrated a guided set of prerequisites intelligently designed into the process, to try and illustrate forces of selection. It's very creative, but do you think anything is convincing here for the unplanned and mindless upward evolution story? When scientists more recently ran other even more sophisticated evolution simulation programs, using more biologically realistic fitness rewards, selection coefficients, in general, the program's selection mechanism broke down completely. Not even a single one of the simplest functions could evolve. Furthermore, when they initially let the simulation run with its artificially high reward settings, so that all of the 9 possible functions arose, and then switched the program to realistic selection coefficients, the virtual organisms within the simulation underwent systematic degeneration, such that all 9 functions were quickly lost. That is, the simulated organism's information content quickly went to 0. Biological Information New Perspectives, a synopsis and limited commentary. Dr. J.C. Sanford. But, why do many scientists have an issue with intelligent causes? ID advocate Dr. Stephen Meyer gives a possible answer. He says, a lot of scientists, because of the influence of materialism, are in a way, inured to the reality of their own minds, and therefore of minds in general. There's a kind of computer simulation known as a genetic algorithm where evolutionary scientists tried to show how the mutation selection mechanism would work. And they do this in a computational environment. They write a little program. They tried to get something that simulates mutation and selection to generate a particular sequence of characters. A phrase from Shakespeare was Richard Dawkins' preferred way of doing it, methinks it is like a weasel. But in order to get the computer to generate the sequence, Dawkins first has to give the computer the sequence, and then he writes the computer program in such a way, as different randomized crops of letter strings are generated. The program selects the ones that are closest in function, that are closest to the future function that he wants. Now, none of the original strings have any linguistic function at all. They don't have any meaning. But the program selects the ones that are closest to the future function that's desired. So he's selecting proximity to future function, not actual function. Now that's problematic, because natural selection selects for functional advantage. It doesn't have the foresight to tell you what might eventually result in some future function. So, the program that Dawkins generates is not actually analogous to what's going on in biology at all, or how the natural selection mechanism must work. But notice also, the extent to which it does work is entirely a function of his own mind, his own intellect. He gave the program the target sequence. He programmed the computer to select the proximity to future function. So, these genetic algorithms invariably end up illustrating the need for a mind to generate information. A similar thing happens with what are known as ribozyme engineering experiments. There, chemists attempt to generate RNA molecules that are capable of copying themselves and thus could conceivably get something like natural selection going, because there would be an element of self-replication. The problem is, as the RNA chemists, the ribozyme engineers have done their work, they've had to sequence the molecules in very specific ways to get any copying capability out of them at all. As it turns out, they've only been able to generate RNA molecules that can copy about 10% of themselves. But even that limited self-replication capability is the product of intelligence, because it was the intelligent agent who essentially, nucleotide base by nucleotide base, determined the informational sequence that RNA molecule, or the RNA ribozyme, has. So, again, what's being simulated? It appears to us what's being simulated is the need for intelligence to generate information. And so, far from the idea that the connection between intelligence and information is only a kind of common sense thing that has no scientific basis, we actually see the attempt to simulate evolution is providing an additional scientific basis for that connection.
9. The second law of thermodynamics says that systems must become more disordered over time. Living cells therefore could not have evolved from inanimate chemicals, and multicellular life could not have evolved from protozoa.
It sounds reasonable, and so far, this has been examined and verified at the theoretical and experimental level with reproducible results. This second law of thermodynamics is also explained or underpinned by the law of increasing entropy, that is to say, the law of increasing disorder, which is the principle of increasing randomness over time. But the article goes on to say,
this argument derives from a misunderstanding of the second law. If it were valid, mineral crystals and snowflakes would also be impossible, because they, too, are complex structures that form spontaneously from disordered parts.
It is easy to imagine that any theoretical physicist who just heard that would be face-palming by now. It seems Mr. Rennie has a misunderstanding of the second law. The entropy of a crystal is actually higher than the entropy of the same substance in solution. It is not always adequate under every circumstance to simply define entropy as disorder. Physicists would argue that the atoms and molecules, which the crystal is made of, are not disordered parts, but in fact highly ordered, complex and precise parts in their own way. Crystals represent a higher state of equilibrium and energy loss than the liquid from which it was formed. Crystals are repeating structures that come about from the way molecules and atoms bond with one another at a certain temperature range. So, within the context of his argument, what is the logical implication of this? In biology, repetition that lacks variation and function tends to jeopardize it. We see this in things like cancer because the information tends toward repetition and lacks the required amount of variability, specificity, and function of both information and parts. The information and mechanisms must be perfectly organized to avoid malfunctioning.
The second law actually states that the total entropy of a closed system, one that no energy or matter leaves or enters, cannot decrease. Entropy is a physical concept, often casually described as disorder, but it differs significantly from the conversational use of the word.
Entropy is governed by statistical principles. It is more about information than physicality. Information is primary for this, not matter and energy. Entropy is the measure of disorder, or the amount of randomness, the amount of uniformity in the distribution of energy or particles, the measure of how homogeneous or evenly mixed up they are, how equalized the distribution of the energy and particles are, or the loss of usable energy, or the loss of specified functional information, and how scrambled it is. It describes the amount of increasing disorganization there is in any system, which is its most general meaning. In everyday language, sometimes people subjectively describe something more evenly mixed or uniform as orderly, but that is not what it means in physics terminology. If things are more mixed together at, or near the atomic level, then at the level of everyday experience there are fewer differences and less available energy in the system. There is also less and less functional information, less specified information, less differentiation, and less interesting, and this means, therefore, entropy has increased, because things have become more random, disorganized, and more evenly mixed up in their distribution when there are many particles, in any open or closed system. But entropy in principle applies to any level of reality, big or small. Disorderly random states are vastly more probable than organized separate distinct arrangements, so it is more than just purely physical. It's the particles within a system, and their probability of an outcome in the laws of motion and interactions, that is the underlying cause of entropy. Everything in the universe tends toward a condition of the highest probability. In naturalistic terms, functionally integrated complexity is a much higher level of order found in human-made technology and biology, and they are considered to be infinitely improbable, dynamic states of being. Closed systems are just theoretical because all things in reality eventually decay. But entropy is a general word that can refer to a wide range of things, from molecular disorganization, right up to the messiness of a teenager's bedroom. And so scientists categorize entropy into different types and levels, to accommodate the many different possible systems in the universe that can be studied. The writer demonstrated how prone he is to another common misunderstanding of the second law, and it is this, he says.
More important, however, the second law permits parts of a system to decrease in entropy, as long as other parts experience an offsetting increase. Thus, our planet as a whole can grow more complex, because the sun pours heat and light onto it, and the greater entropy associated with the sun's nuclear fusion, more than, rebalances the scales. Simple organisms can fuel their rise toward complexity by consuming other forms of life and non-living materials.
If any system is closed off from receiving input of extra available energy, closed off from receiving input of more information, or closed to intelligent direction, it will always progress toward maximum entropy. It is a closed system and is doomed to the perpetual irregular molecular motions. Unfortunately, for the casual reader, complexity has been wrongly conflated with functional complexity. This claimed way of rebalancing things is a fallacy. It has nothing to do with science. This oversimplified and incomplete just-so story missed some simple but crucial points. In reality, the amount of entropy determines the amount of unusable energy within a system. The sun can certainly add energy to the earth, which is an example of the first law in action, the conservation of energy, or energy being transferred. But when, and how, is the energy usable, and by what, exactly? There is a confusing definition of the word complexity in his statement. Random sunlight by itself does not create more order. When fed into an open system, more available energy, yes, but not more functional complexity. An increase in energy from an outside source is not by itself going to produce an increase in the kind of complexity required to evolve a sophisticated biological mechanism that can harness the energy for its own functional use. These biological systems that can harness the sun's energy into useful work have only ever been observed, without exception, to already possess greater order. That is to say, they already have complex integrated components, the functions of which appear to be irreducible, and have information processing abilities at the molecular level, which enables them to harness solar energy into work, which in turn enables the replication and reiteration of apparent complexity from DNA code and molecular machines. Otherwise, without these irreducibly complex systems in place, the sun's energy is only observed to cause more disorder, more randomness, more decay, and more entropy, which renders the energy largely unavailable for creative use. Since evolution theory cannot be substantiated by demonstrating that ludicrously giant step from non-life to life, those vague ideas about abiogenesis, spontaneous generation, and upward evolution, macroevolution, do not seem like tenable hypotheses, when looking at all the experimental evidence currently available to us. All scientific experiments ever done on this demonstrate that energy will always cause more disorder if not harnessed and directed by a more highly complex mechanism, and even when those complex systems are in place too, even then, a certain amount of energy is still always lost from these systems. You can never break even, there is no free lunch, only diminishing returns. The same rule applies to both human-made technology and biology. Experiments and observations never show more order arising from less order, but they always show the opposite, less order coming from more order. By order we mean either functional complexity, or usable energy, or both. This is the only way that a flow of energy can be harnessed and utilized. Undirected energy accelerates the increasing disorder and decay of any system, and to a lesser degree, even directed and utilized energy does also. Because once you use it, you cannot get all of it back again for reuse, and systems incur wear and tear in one way or another. The observations of this are repeatable wherever you look. No exceptions to this rule have ever been found. For example, a living animal will maintain its complexity, but the systems in a dead animal will decay. Other organisms that eat the dead animal benefit only because they, while alive, have those highly ordered energy-utilizing mechanisms still functioning, that enable them to use available energy from what they eat. More sunlight or heat will only accelerate the decay, if those biomechanisms are not in place to make use of it. All tests have only shown that biology copies and remixes genes. But it never creates new functional genes. Instead, population geneticists will tell you, the opposite happens. Copying mistakes constantly accumulate and result in less function. Natural forces alone without biological mechanisms have never been observed to do anything that produces the integrated complexities observed in biology. Certainly, one side of a planet might be warmer than the other side of it, but the total average temperature of the planet will not change without more or less energy being poured onto it from elsewhere or radiating away into space. But in such an open system, the flow of usable energy still progresses toward maximum equilibrium, toward being less useful. So, Darwinists' explanations in this regard cannot refute the idea of an intelligent designer being needed for the existence of living organisms. Undirected energy by itself cannot eliminate randomness or create the more complex mechanistic function, as far as science has established. That is what the testable evidence shows us. This means that speculative ideas, like spontaneous generation and macroevolution, remain as being anti-scientific, and not even good enough as pseudo-scientific arguments, and credulous. If this critical point is not correctly explained to those to whom it is being taught, then this might be shamefully incompetent of the institution or person doing the teaching. And this is why some of the best scientists, even the agnostic ones, never make theological knowledge claims one way or the other, but constrain their arguments to scientifically proven facts, and are therefore cautious and non-dogmatic in their narratives when going above and beyond such, when using speculative statements containing belief or imagination. Science is old enough and advanced enough to insist on these constraints. Never mind the unbridled imagination, these are the facts. No higher genetic information beyond already programmed limits has ever been observed to arise against such entropic improbabilities. The opposite has been reproducibly demonstrated in all such experiments, showing only reiterative or degenerative processes. Even in open systems that do not possess complex energy harnessing mechanisms, entropy still has only been observed to increase, and even those systems possessing energy utilization capability still eventually decay. In all systems thus far, by science, it has been shown that the amount of available energy for work decreases or the available amount of functional information degrades in a system over time. In the interests of true science, it is important to emphasize that there have never been any empirical contradictions of this fundamental entropy law. It is one of the best tested laws in all of science, and the best of theoretical explanations, that is, the statistical mechanics of increasing entropy and information theory. The quality of entropy generated locally cannot be negative irrespective of whether the system is isolated or not. Arnold Sommerfeld, Thermodynamics and Statistical Mechanics, 1958, 155. There needs to be a usage of proper scientific skepticism, and avoidance of being ideologically committed to an imaginary idea, which is stretching credibility to invoke blind faith in something that has never been observed, only because this helped for, but never observed make-believe anti-entropy, is a vital link in the chain of belief requirements for Darwinian evolution theory to seem plausible, only so that one is fooled into thinking that it is right to continue accepting it. A chain is only as good as its weakest link. The idea that natural selection can make localized entropy reverse is an extremely weak link in the chain of evolutionary beliefs, and all evidence shows that it's a broken link and even a non-existent link. Although in our ignorance, we cannot say that localized micro-reversals never occur. Firstly, it has never been observed, and secondly, never proven that such a thing could create or improve functional complexity or increase specified genetic information, and in all situations has so far been computed to be ultra-astronomically unlikely. What does this say about the argument being put forth? Micro-reversals seem to be at best just part of the overall randomness of a system. All we have available to rescue this vital link for neo-Darwinian belief, if to the extent that there is such a belief, is no more than a murky construct of the abstract human imagination. Many now think that the entropy law is a foremost example of how true operational scientific methods refute Darwinism and reveals how this kind of evolutionism is not scientific but a religious belief or a philosophy that contradicts empirically supported scientific experiments and discovery. All experience points to the fact that every living organism eventually dies. This process in which the highly developed order of the organism is reduced to a random and disorderly collection of molecules. We are reminded that we are dust, and to dust, we ultimately return. R.B. Lindsay, Entropy, Consumption and Values in Physical Science. American Scientist, September 1959, 384. It would seem that the doctrine of macroevolution is the foremost modern example of pseudo-scientific fraud ever perpetrated on a significant portion of humanity. This is such a huge topic and it needs to be discussed further, in more detail, and at the very least, we must devote an entire chapter to the entropy phenomenon.